They're both whispering quietly at the kitchen table, voices sharp, and Phil thinks they might be arguing, or just talking about something serious. Bad immediately stands up out of his seat when Phil walks in. He stumbles over his words for a moment, mouth opening and closing as he stares at Phil. Then, "Would you like a drink?" "Tea?" Phil asks, and Bad immediately goes to get a cup. Phil sits down across from Skeppy, who leans his elbows onto the table and looks at Phil with an analyzing look, as if he's trying to figure out Phil's secrets. Bad comes back to the table with a bit of a rush, sliding the cup over to Phil. It's warm, and Phil takes a careful sip. It's not bad. They all sit in silence for a moment, Phil staring at the table before him, focused on a small groove set in the wood. He sighs quietly. "So?" Skeppy starts. "Kids are asleep." "I hope so." Phil grins. Skeppy seems like he's about to say something else, but he doesn't. Phil takes another sip from his cup. "Would you mind if we ask questions?" Bad asks quietly. "I know it's been a long night for you, and you must want to rest, but..." Both him and Skeppy share a glance at each other. Phil can practically see the curiosity eating them alive. He won't lie, he's curious too. It's been a while since people have even realized that avians aren't supposed to be around. With today, though, Phil wonders if word will get out, or if it's already gotten out. In that case, Phil's heart is going to weigh a little more heavily. He doesn't look forward to people knowing anything about him, but in a way, he's trading knowledge over his past in exchange for his son's safety. And with a trade like that, Phil will do it in a heartbeat. The past is painful. But even with how much Phil wishes it would just fade, he will watch it painfully come back to life over and over again if it's for his sons. "Look," Skeppy says. "Bad knows more than me, but from what we know, from what we had been sure of, all avians were killed centuries ago. They're all gone." Phil's hands hold tightly onto the cup in his hands. "Is that true?" Bad asks carefully. "Because you're here, right in front of us. And if you're here, then there must be others, right? I thought avians were killed, but you..." Phil sighs, and Bad stops, looking sorry. "This isn't really something I ever wanted to talk about," Phil murmurs, raising his cup to his lips. He doesn't take a sip, just holds it there, then puts it back down. "But with what you've both done today, you have saved my life. And you helped my children. So I need to pay that back somehow. And if you know that of my people, then it's understandable that you're curious." Bad frowns. "So, the avians..." His voice holds a little bit of hope, and he leans forward, wishing for an answer that isn't so painful. Please let it be that they're just in hiding. Let it be that they've traveled somewhere far. Phil looks up at both of them with a soft smile. He's lived with this information for a long time, and so he's become a bit numb to it. But to them, he feels as if he needs to break it softly. He puts it bluntly either way. They're all gone. They were killed off a long time ago. Skeppy's eyes widened a bit as the words sink in. All three of them are still, and Phil takes a sip of his tea. Skeppy leans back in his seat with a silent sigh as Bad's expression shifts into something unreadable. "But..." Bad trails off. "But you're here?" Phil smiles again, and it can only be described as sorrowful. a tired, sympathetic smile. There isn't anyone else other than me. I've searched, believe me. I'm the last one. You can't be sure of that. I am. Phil nods slowly. But that... Bad stammers, his face falling into something broken, nearly angry. That would make you... all this time. Phil shrugs. I've gotten used to it. There's nothing else for me to do. Or rather, nothing else that I will choose to do. But that means you're the only one left. Skeppy repeats, quietly. That's... cruel, he wants to say. Terribly cruel. What happened? Bad asks, and it's nearly demanding. What do you know of prophecies? Phil asks, tilting his head. The real ones, that come from priests, magic users. They're incredibly rare, Skeppy says, as Bad drops his head into his hands, needing a moment to recover from the crushing truth that an entire people was wiped out, save for a single survivor. Unpredictable as to when they appear, but they're true in every way from what's been seen. They're not! Phil snaps, and Bad raises his head, both of them looking surprised. Prophecies themselves don't mean anything. It's the people that make them true. The stories mean nothing. The rumors mean nothing, if it's never actually carried out. Would Wilbur and Techno actually go on to destroy the world if they were given a caring, loving home? What reason would they have for killing everything there is? What good is a prophecy when its words are useless? Have you heard of the recent prophecy? There's a new one? Bad asks, eyes wide. My sons are destined to grow up with unimaginable power and end the world as we know it. Phil deadpans. Getting slow blinks in response. Or so people say. Skeppy raises a finger towards the hallway, where Techno and Wilbur sleep. Those kids? And one other. Phil nods. 3 monsters, meant to carry out an apocalypse of some sort. You can imagine how most would react to hearing a prophecy like that. They would want to stop it. Phil holds up a finger to his throat and swipes it across, Bad's face scrunching up in disgust. Through any means necessary. They're children, Bad whispers. They are. They're my children now. I picked up Techno when he was small. Found Wilbur not too long ago. The third child, he's in a town that's a bit far from here. I plan on taking them in. But they're meant to destroy the world? Skeppy says slowly, and it's more of a question. They'll only do that if they have a reason. What reason would they have if I take them away and raise them well? Why would they ever destroy everything if I teach them that it's their home? Huh. Skeppy blinks. Wait, what does this have to do with your people? Phil's face pulls into a frown, and he feels a heavy weight on his chest. Have you ever heard of the Angel of Death? Phil asks, and the words taste bitter on his tongue. Bad seems to think for a moment, and Skeppy just shakes his head. I don't think so, Bad answers after a moment. It was a prophecy similar to this one, Phil says quietly. History repeats itself, he mutters. When people are scared, they do drastic things. Right now, they want to kill 3 children for a chance at saving the world from an end they're not even sure will come true. Back then... Phil pauses. Back then, there was another prophecy. Bad leans back in his chair with a patient look, and Skeppy lowers his eyes to stare at the table as Phil chokes out the reason as to why his people died. Back then, There was a new prophecy that swept through the lands. A new threat that could rise up, specific to the avian species. The so-called Angel of Death. Someone who would become dangerous, kill thousands upon thousands, with pitch-black wings and a bloody sword. Rumors spread. People became fearful. It was said the Angel of Death would kill without mercy. It was said that they would slaughter without hesitation, leaving a path of blood behind them. A threat to the lands, to the people. So, then, the search began. At first, it had just been a few. Just a few avians singled out, one with too much of a temper, too much of a threat. Then it was anyone who knew how to fight well, then those who were capable of being dangerous. At first, they were just locked up. But then it became apparent that too many avians were being locked away, their feathers snipped. And when you take someone's freedom, they're bound to fight for it back. Conflicts rose up, and when avians fought back, it had apparently confirmed people's fears. So then it got worse. Then it was anyone who would be deemed a threat. But that list of avians that could be deemed a threat kept growing. More and more until it was almost baffling. Until children were on the list. Because what if they grow up to be a threat? What if they grow up to be the Angel of Death? And it only became worse. Phil knows what it's like to be hunted. And he also knows what it's like to watch as others are shot out of the sky. What it's like to watch as loved ones get their wings hacked off. What it's like to watch. No choice but to either run or die alongside them. He knows how it's like to be on the run, flying to somewhere that might be safe, and then it's not safe. And people he knew, he had to see them fall. Phil leans forward, pressing his forehead to the table. Tea forgotten. His wings are held tightly to his back as his words die in his throat for a moment. Skeppy stares at him with a horrified expression, and Bad holds a hand to his face, gasping a bit as he cries. There's only one reason as to why Phil is still alive. He's been shot out of the sky before. He survived, and then didn't have a single mark to prove it. This is why. Phil says, holding up his necklace, watching it glow underneath his fingertips. It's enchanted with something I couldn't even explain. Phil pauses. Someone I love made it for me. And she thought it would at least help if I got hurt. She overcompensated a bit, I think. He smiles sadly. It'll keep you safe. He remembers even now her voice telling him. God's how he missed her. At least she hadn't died alone, like so many. Kristen died with Phil holding her close, and she died with the absolute joy that the things she made for him had worked. Both of them, shot out of the sky, and yet Phil would forever be all right. It's kept me alive. Even after so long, I'm still here. Phil murmurs. And Skeppy clears his throat. And everyone else were eventually killed. I became the last one because I wouldn't die. And in a way, I think the prophecy was supposed to be true there. Phil traces his finger over his necklace, the heart forever glowing red. I was angry. I didn't have a way to die, but I had a sword, and the knowledge that all my people were murdered. Phil had become the Angel of Death. He was the only one with wings left, the only one able to pick up a sword. That title was his, and he could never take it off nor give it away. So, he accepted that title. But he didn't accept the actions that were supposed to come with it. I went into hiding for a long while. Phil says quietly, voice tired. Killing everyone else as a revenge, that would have been carrying out the prophecy. That would have made it true. Maybe I should have followed it. Phil leans back, closing his eyes. I didn't. I hid and ran and stayed hidden until they thought they had done it. Until word got out that the threat was gone and the angel of death was gone as well. Then what? Skeppy asks, Bad wiping at his face, his shoulders shaking as he cries again. Skeppy pays him no mind, letting him cry in peace. They get away with doing something like that? Everyone who was ever a part of that shit show was long gone to time, mate. Phil sighs. Even if I decided today to take revenge, they're all dead and gone anyway. And then it was just Phil figuring out how to be in the world again. How to walk without the threat on his shoulders of being killed for being alive. And then... I don't want revenge, though, Phil says. I want to prevent it from happening again. Because it's going to happen again. Not at the scale of all his people being hunted down and killed, but it is still history repeating itself. Those kids sleeping in the room down the hall. They're being hunted as we speak, just for being alive. I refuse to let them be killed. Bad takes a sharp breath in, rubbing at his eyes. Can we help? He asks, voice wavering. Skeppy? Bad sniffles. We can help, Bad. Skeppy nods, Bad nodding, and crying even more. Skeppy looks at Phil. If there's anything we can do, let us know. We've lived in relative peace in this forest for a long while. I don't mind disrupting the peace for a bit if it's for something like this. Thank you. Phil whispers. That means more than you know. Oh, Bad makes a sad noise, breathing in deeply and trying to brush off the last of his tears. For a while, I used to travel around to try and figure out what happened to your people, and all I ever found was just scraps of how they lived. I have something that you can have if you want. Phil waits for Bad to catch his breath, smiling. I suppose I'll see. Okay. Bad huffs, trying to breathe. Okay, follow me. Bad gets up from his seat, sniffing once more and walking down the hall, Phil getting up to follow him. They walk past the room where Wilbur and Techno are sleeping, and instead go into a room where each wall is filled with books. Piles of books are on the ground, papers in a somewhat organized chaos, pens scattered on the desk that sits to the side. Phil blinks a bit and takes it all in. Bad just goes to search through a pile of books, taking only a minute to grab one with a deep green cover. It had been in bad shape when I found it, but I rewrote the entire thing by hand into a new book. Bad says, holding it out to Phil. I hope that's all right. Phil stares at the book offered to him, and he takes it from Bad's hands, turning it over to look at the cover. It's blank, just a simple dark green, so he opens it up, skimming through the words. It's a book for healing remedies, recipes for cures, for medicine. It's a book that was specifically made by his people. He remembers these medicines, remembers how they had been so common for his folk, people always knowing it by heart. Phil pauses, mouth clicking shut. This is everything to him. Not just because he now has a piece from before, in his hands, in good shape, but this means he can use it. Can teach it, even. Maybe Techno and Will could know these by heart one day. I have more. Bad admits, quietly. Phil closing the book in his hands, eyes wide. Several more. You can have them all, since they're all yours. I don't... Phil stammers. I don't know where I would put them. Well... Bad hums, looking around the room. When you have all your children together, maybe you guys could move somewhere safe. And you could keep it in your home then. In his home. Phil closes the book quietly, remembering that, yes, that's the goal. To take these children away and make a home. His heart fills with hope at the idea of that. The last child, though. Bad. Phil says, Bad, raising his head. The last kid that I need to get to. He's far from here. And I hate to admit this, but it's hard to travel while trying to keep Techno and Wilbur safe. Hunters keep following our trail, and I just... Phil hesitates. I don't know if I can trust you with this, but with what you've said and with what I've seen... They can stay here till you return with your last kid, Skeppy says, leaning into the doorframe as Phil and Bad turn their heads to him. They'll be safe. Oh, I wouldn't mind at all. Bad nods, clasping his hands together. If it means it'd be easier for you to save the last one, then by all means they can stay. Would it be all right? Phil asks, his voice frailer than he wants it to be. Me and Skeppy have been watching over this forest for over a century. Bad grins, and when Phil looks up, he finds glowing eyes staring at him. Bad is a good person, but when he looks like that, even Phil is sure that he could be a bit dangerous. There won't be a single person who can hurt them. You swear? Phil asks. I swear. Bad speaks with something unnatural twisted into his words, and Skeppy just laughs. Phil still needs time to think about it. It seems like a good choice. The boys may not like it, with Phil having to leave for a bit. But he has a feeling they'll forgive him when he comes back with their new brother. He walks back to his room with the new book in his hands, and he opens the door quietly, closing it behind him. Technoblade and Wilbur are sleeping soundly, quiet snores reaching Phil's ears as he goes to put the book down on the desk. He pauses, resting his palm onto the table. He's so close. Now he has help. Now he's so close to his goal. Then it's to find somewhere safe, and then... Phil won't lie. He's excited for a simple life of trying to raise 3 kids who will most likely drive him crazy. His heart feels fond as he turns back towards Will and Techno, watching them both sleep peacefully. He goes to join them, careful not to jostle them too much. It's futile, though. Once they realize Phil's back, they're both up, and they grab out with reaching hands towards him. Dad, Techno fell asleep, Wilbur whispers, Phil snickering as he scoots back, laying down on the bed with Wilbur resting against his chest. Technoblade curls up at Phil's side, Phil keeping his arm wrapped around him as Techno shoves his face into his neck. Did he? Phil whispers back. You took so long, Technoblade mutters, yawning. I was tired. Go to sleep, mate, Phil says softly. Techno hums. Good night, you two. Good night. Good night. Phil smiles, closing his eyes with them, and knowing for a fact that while the past was cruel, his future will be precious. He sleeps with a smile. Chapter 17. Promises. Phil wakes up with a small knee digging into his gut and not-so-quiet whispers over his head. He had been hoping to wake up slowly, peacefully, from maybe some sort of dream. But instead he gets his kids trying to do something while he's asleep. While Phil's first instinct is to open his eyes and see what the heck they're up to, he stays still and keeps his eyes shut. Mostly because he's still a bit tired. And also, he wants to try and figure out what they're even doing. Trying to sneak around Phil. Shh. Technoblade holds a finger over his mouth, trying to help Wilbur climb over Phil, since Wilbur had been sleeping on the other side of the bed, and Phil is blocking the way. You're gonna wake him up. You pulled me too hard, Wilbur whispers back, and Phil can feel his weight shift, carefully moving over Phil to go towards Phil's right, where Techno seems to be on his feet, already off the bed. I think I woke him up, Wilbur mumbles. No, he's sleeping, Technoblade insists, trying to get Wilbur to move already, rather than linger. Look, he still has his eyes closed. Phil resists the urge to laugh a little, with how Technoblade stresses his words. I accidentally hit him with my knee. Then don't do it again. Techno deadpans. I didn't mean to do it. Wilbur huffs, annoyed. Phil shifts his wings from underneath him. He's awake! He can feel Wilbur's weight balancing precariously on the edge of the bed. He wonders if Wilbur is just standing near the edge of the mattress. No, he isn't, Techno says back. Phil feels a finger poke at his face. He tries his best not to flinch, and to keep a smile at bay. It's nearly impossible. Wait. Another poke. No, he's sleeping. Is he? Wilbur asks, and Phil takes that moment to snap his eyes open and sit up with a rush. He sees Wilbur standing next to him, on the edge of the bed like he thought, and he wraps an arm around Wilbur's middle and yanks him down, ignoring the little scream of surprise that comes with it. He's awake! He's awake! Wilbur yells, kicking his legs as he's pulled in, held hostage by Phil's arms. Gotcha! Phil grins, Wilbur squealing and trying to slap his hands up towards Phil's face. Phil just leans back, snickering a bit. Where's Techno? Where'd he go? He looks off the side of the bed and finds that Techno is nowhere to be found. The door is closed shut, though, and he heard Techno just a moment prior. I don't know, Wilbur lies, and he dissolves into giggles as Phil tickles him in response. He stays unyielding of any info as to where Techno has gone, though, so Phil just keeps one arm wrapped around the kid to keep him trapped, and he leans off the side of the bed, looking down towards the floor. Technoblade looks back with wide eyes, kneeling down on the ground with a stance that reminds him of a startled animal. There you are, Phil says, Technoblade making a face like he's been caught in the act. He tries to get away, Phil leaning off the bed and grabbing him around the torso too, heaving him up with him and Wilbur. He shrieks as Phil pulls him up. What are you two doing? What were you doing? Phil demands, holding them both close and snickering as they both frantically try to get away. They yell as they get trapped with a wall of feathers, Phil's wings wrapping around them both. Wilbur sneezes. This, right here, is everything that Phil will ever fight for. His heart is impossibly full as he holds two struggling kids in his arms, trying to run away from getting caught in whatever they were doing. What were you doing, actually? Phil asks, pulling his wings back a bit, just as Wilbur tries to bite his feathers in an attempt to escape. Phil snorts at the way Wilbur snaps his mouth open and closed in an empty threat. We were trying to let you sleep, Technoblade gives, kicking and struggling one last time before going limp, laying against Phil as a dead weight. Wilbur woke you up, he complains, seeming disappointed just a bit. No, I didn't, Wilbur responds, twisting in Phil's grip so he can face Techno. You poked him awake, I was checking if he was asleep. By poking him? Phil huffs, resting his chin onto Techno's hair. You both could have woken me up, mate. I don't need more rest. Wilbur makes a sound that's clearly disagreeing. No, you said that you heal fast if you're asleep. He tilts his head up at Phil, grey eyes narrowed at him. A tiny glare, challenging Phil to just try and disagree. I'm already healed, Will. Phil reassures. I'm all patched up. I'm much better now. You got stabbed. Technoblade reminds. I got better. I think you should go back to sleep. Wilbur nods, hitting a hand at Phil's chest. Me and Technoblade can go get food, and then you can take a nap. Yeah, that sounds good. Technoblade agrees, nodding along. Phil scoffs a bit. Really, I'm okay. I don't need to rest anymore. He lets go of them both, leaning back on the bed. He gets matching faces of doubt towards him. I think you should go back to bed. Technoblade suggests, poking at Phil's knee. Yeah, you look really tired. Wilbur nods, Phil rolling his eyes. Like, very tired. You need lots of sleep. I'm okay. Phil turns and swings his feet off the bed, ignoring the way Wilbur and Techno's face go slightly panicked. Technoblade tries to grab onto his arm and lies down on the bed to keep Phil from getting up. Look, why don't we go have Bad check on my bandages, and then we'll see if I still need rest, okay? Phil knows for a fact the wound has already been healed. His necklace has simmered down, no longer glowing bright red, and he doesn't feel any sort of ache of an unhealed injury on his side. However, the kids don't seem so confident in Phil's healing abilities. Nope. Wilbur tries to make a grab for Phil's wings, only getting gently smacked in the face with feathers. No, you're really tired. I don't think so. Phil grins, and he stands up, Wilbur nearly falling off the bed so he can quickly run and get in front of Phil, holding his arms out. I'll use my voice, Wilbur threatens, Technoblade whining as he tries to hold on to Phil's arm, half hanging off the bed. No, give your voice a rest. You still sound raspy. Phil says sternly, and Wilbur makes a face like he's slightly guilty, his mouth staying shut. Instead, he holds his hands out, trying to push Phil backwards. Phil barely budges, and he fails to keep a smile back, easily walking forward, even with how much Wilbur is attempting to keep him from going anyway. Wilbur's feet slide across the floor, and Technoblade is still hanging onto his arm, stumbling behind Phil as he tries to pull the avian back. He resorts to grabbing onto Phil's leg instead, holding on like an octopus, shoving his face into Phil's leg. No, nuh-uh, Wilbur protests, trying to push back and failing miserably. Phil pauses for a second, then reaches down and picks him up with both arms, lifting Wilbur over his shoulder and carrying him there. Wilbur kicks his legs, making a frustrated noise as he tries to hit Phil's back with tiny fists. No, go lay down! Let's go see what we can have for breakfast, Phil says, making his way towards the door, dragging Techno with his foot and carrying a kicking Wilbur on his shoulder. No, Phil, go sit down! He comes across Skeppy in the hallway, who just stands to the side in a doorway with a perplexed face. Phil just shrugging. Kids, Phil says, like that's a proper explanation. Skeppy just holds his hands up, his face a clear sign that he wants no part of it, and he turns around to just walk into the room. Phil is able to make it to the kitchen, with a bit of difficulty, since he has two kids trying their very best to not let him keep walking. Wilbur is just laying limp now, but he's still protesting very loudly, giving his opinion on Phil escaping the room. Phil stops and looks down at Techno, who still holds on for dear life, stuck to Phil's leg. This is bullshit! Wilbur swears, Phil choking on a laugh. He thinks he can feel Techno snort against his leg. There's a clatter of something falling to the floor, and Phil looks up to find Bad in the kitchen by the counters, face appalled. He sputters, reaching down to pick up a fork, and carrying it to the sink to wash it. Language! And good morning. Mornin', Phil chimes in. Help? He gestures to Technoblade still stuck on his leg, and Bad blinks a bit. They still think I should be resting. Well, maybe you should if they're so insistent. Bad smiles, putting the fork away and turning to the stove, where there seems to be food cooking. You were hurt just yesterday. I'm fine, Phil drawls, leaning down to put Wilbur back on his feet. Wilbur stands with his arms crossed and an upset expression on his face, and Techno raises his head towards him. They're just worried. Wilbur. Technoblade whispers, and Wilbur gets the program near instantly, quickly dropping to the ground and taking Phil's other leg hostage, even with how Phil tries to step back and prevent it. No! Phil exclaims, Bad looking behind him to see Phil sigh with a defeated expression. You two, get up. No. Technoblade responds, simply, and Wilbur seems happy with that being their answer. Well, I can confidently say that your dad is going to be just fine. Bad smiles, standing up straight and putting the pile of old bandages to the side. Phil's injury has already faded off into a light mark on his skin, like Phil expected it to. The bandages are hardly needed now, and Phil is perfectly fine, ready to go. Wilbur and Techno are both eating their breakfast in small bowls, cut up pieces of pancakes with some syrup mixed in. They're sitting at the kitchen table, across from where Phil had been checked by Bad. Phil tugs his shirt down and leans back in his seat with a smile, looking towards Wilbur and Techno to find that Wilbur is stabbing his pancakes with a frown. And Technoblade squints his eyes towards Phil's direction, as if he's suspicious if Phil has actually healed or not. Are you sure? Wilbur asks, chewing on his food. Yes, I'm very sure. Phil is all healed up. Magic. Phil waves his hands in the air, and he sounds like he's joking, but he knows that's the truth. Technoblade shakes his head. I still think Phil should take a nap. I agree. Wilbur nods, Phil rolling his eyes fondly. I don't need it. Phil insists. I'm all right, really. My necklace helped like I said it would. Phil holds up the necklace in question for a moment, before tucking it underneath his shirt, like how he always has it. Meh. Technoblade makes a vague noise, chewing on his food with an unhappy expression. But you were bleeding. A lot. I can't stay hurt, mate. I heal faster than others, a lot faster. I know, yesterday it was bad. Phil trails off, Wilbur staring at him with too much behind his eyes. Phil can't handle the sad look that's held in them. But I'm okay now, and I'll always be okay. Are you sure? Techno asks, staring down at his plate and poking at his food. I'm sure. I've survived through worse, don't worry. I'm durable. Technoblade doesn't look entirely convinced, but he seems satisfied, and he nods. He turns to Wilbur, who looks back at him, and they seem to say something to each other silently through their eyes. Wilbur turns to Phil. You better be more careful from now on. It's a quiet threat. I'll try my best. Phil promises. It's not your fault you got hurt anyway. Technoblade points out, pushing his plate away, leaning back in his seat. It's because of the hunters. They are shit. Wilbur sings songs, and Phil gives him an incredulous look, hearing Bad sputter again from where he was doing dishes and trying to give them space. Language! Phil holds back a snort. He's heard Wilbur swear a few times before, having picked up words from when before Phil had found him. He's not going to tell the kid to stop swearing. If anything, he finds it funny, for a kid so tiny to be swearing with such fury. He's gently told Wilbur before to refrain from certain words at certain times, but overall, Phil thinks it's hilarious. They're persistent. I feel like it's gotten worse with each time, with them trying to find you both. Phil frowns, leaning his elbows on the table. It was a close call yesterday. I killed a few, Technoblade says, just as Skeppy walks into the kitchen. Skeppy blinks. What? Bad is in the same state, having turned off the sink to turn around and look with a worried expression. Phil just sighs softly. I'm sorry you had to do that, Techno. I mean, I'm not sad about it, Technoblade says, nearly sassy with his tone. I kinda think they deserved it. I mean, they were trying to kill you and Wilbur. I think they deserved it. Wilbur agrees, scooting up in his seat. He holds a finger up. If they didn't want to die, then they shouldn't have tried to kill us. Very true. Phil nods, smiling, and Skeppy turns around and walks back out. Bad follows with a bit of a frantic speed to his steps. He's not one to go killing people. If anything, Bad prefers to not kill anyone. But he knows that Phil's reasons make sense. And he knows that if they were backed into a corner, then it's reasonable. Phil watches Bad scurry away with a huff, and he looks back to Wilbur and Technoblade. I wanted to talk to you two about something. They lift their heads with curiosity, Wilbur still eating the last of his breakfast. Techno slides his plate to Wilbur, and Wilbur takes it without a word, eating what's left in there. First, what happened yesterday, I don't want it to happen ever again. That was too close. I wasn't able to do anything. I couldn't protect you. Things could have gone so much worse, and Phil is grateful that this forest was protected like they were told. The idea of waking up, Technoblade and Wilbur gone while Phil had been powerless to stop it? It leaves a terrible feeling on his chest. I'm sorry for that, Phil says. Wilbur chews slowly at his food with a thoughtful look, and Technoblade just snorts. We'll be okay, Dad, Technoblade says, and Phil's heart squeezes. Me and Wilbur are supposed to get stronger, right? Then you don't have to worry about it, because I'll be able to fight him off, and Wilbur will be able to use his voice. We can protect you. He seems confident in his words, and Phil doesn't doubt his claim for a second. He remembers what that witch had told him before. While his kids don't have to destroy the world, they definitely have the capacity to. They'll grow up to have the power to do that, to cause the apocalypse. And while the idea of them being safe with their own abilities is comforting, they're not quite there yet. Quietly, Phil wonders if all of this will be enough to stop the apocalypse from ever happening. If it'll somehow be triggered either way. No, Phil refuses to let that happen. Phil refuses to have his kids end up in that fate. You're not strong enough right now, though, Phil reminds him, gently. You're still a kid. You're still young, and I don't want you to fight. I want this to be over so we can go somewhere safe. Somewhere safe? Wilbur asks, face scrunching up. Once I have your brother and we're all together again, we can go somewhere safe. Phil tells him, clasping his hands together on the table, keeping his voice level and almost hopeful. Somewhere to hide out, and not have to worry about hunters and all of that. No more running. Wilbur makes a sound that could almost be a scoff. No more. Where would we even hide? Wilbur's been running his whole life. Always found out, always sold out. Nowhere is safe in his mind. But then again, Phil is safe. Then again, Phil would never sell him out, so this is different. New. There's places to go, mate. Phil smiles. But before we can think about that, I need to go. We need to go. Technoblade corrects, raising an eyebrow. For the last kid, right? Phil nods. Yes, but I mean what I said. He pauses a bit, watching both Wilbur and Techno blink at him, their faces morphing into something of the start of panic. I'm gonna go get him, alone. You both are staying here. Wilbur's face falls into something like horror, and he drops his fork into his bowl, eyes wide. No? He breathes out, and Phil's heart breaks a little. He nearly takes back his words right there. Hell no! Technoblade yells, slamming his hands onto the table. Phil is a bit taken aback by that one. You can't go on your own! You said you were staying, Wilbur accuses. You'll get hurt if you go alone, Technoblade protests. Boys, Phil says. No, you're not leaving, no! Wilbur shakes his head, his hands curling into fists. You said you weren't going to leave us. We can still do it like how we've been doing it, traveling together. Technoblade insists, nearly desperate. We'll be really careful. You promised. Boys. Phil stands up, his voice heavy and serious. His wings fold out a bit, making him seem a bit bigger than he really is. And both Techno and Wilbur stare up at him, matching tears in their eyes. Listen, he says more softly. Wilbur's already started crying. Phil makes his way around the table, quickly going to them both. He picks up Technoblade out of his seat and sits down on the ground, pulling Wilbur down with him as well. He holds them both close, letting them cling on tightly. Listen. Phil starts again, speaking softly. What happened yesterday will happen again, if we all keep moving like how we have been. People are looking for us, looking for you both. It's going to get harder and harder to run away. It's safer if you both stay here, and I go on my own. He leans down, brushing his chin on top of Wilbur's hair. I don't have to leave right away. I could go tomorrow. But if I go on my own, it'll be safer and faster. I'll come back as fast as I can, and when I get back, you'll have a new little brother. But I don't want you to leave. Wilbur chokes out, his face hidden in Phil's shirt. And what if you don't come back? What if you get attacked on the way there? You could get hurt. Technoblade mumbles. You could get hurt by hunters. You could get caught or killed. I can't die, Techno. Phil says gently. My necklace, remember? No matter what happens, I'll be all right. You don't know that. Wilbur says quietly, and Phil holds them both a little tighter. You don't know. I know that I'm going to save the last kid, and I'm going to take you all somewhere safe so we can have a home. Look at me. Phil holds one hand to each of their faces, makes them look up. They're both crying, faces scrunched up and wet with tears. I'll come back. I promise I'll come back. There is nothing that can stop me from coming back to you both. It'll only be for a short while. Then there won't be any reason for me to leave you ever again. Phil can't have it all be lost now. Not when he's so close. Not when he's so close to finally having it all. Anyone who would dare stand in his way of finally having his kids safe and together, he will kill them without a second thought. Phil leans down close to both their faces, trying hard to keep it together himself. I know you both don't want me to leave. I know you'll be worried. I can't lose. Wilbur starts, his voice breaking off in a sob. I'm not abandoning you. I'm not, I swear. I'll be back. I will be back. I will fight to come back to you, I promise you. Phil swallows, biting at the inside of his cheek before going on. If you really, really don't want me to, then I won't. If you can't have me leave, then I won't go. We can travel together, like we did before. But I want you both to consider, because if we go out and keep going like how we have been... Phil stops, his voice wavering too much. He takes a moment to clear his throat. I could lose you both. Technoblade closes his eyes, holding onto the front of Phil's shirt tightly. What happened last night will happen again. It'll happen again, and I know you're both strong. You're both so strong. But Phil can't always stay watching. Phil can't always be there, always be on guard. Phil, even with all his efforts, has a limit, has a breaking point, and he can't risk that chance. But I can't protect you. Phil whispers, and he chokes back tears. There might be a time where I can't be there to save you, or help you, and I can't let that happen. So I'm asking you to please, just consider it. Wilbur tucks his head underneath Phil's, his hand holding on tightly to Techno's. Technoblade tilts his head down, shoulders shaking a bit, as he tries to lean even more into Phil's arms. Please. Phil barely breathes out, and he feels like he's pleading with the universe, rather than his kids. He feels like he's asking for a chance, for a small chance for all of this to be okay. Phil is asking for fate to please be kind to him just this once. Just this once. They both sit quietly, together on the floor for a long while, until... You don't have to go right away, right? Wilbur says quietly, and he squeezes Techno's hand in his. Techno squeezes back. No. And we can wait until tomorrow? Tomorrow. Phil nods just a bit. Wilbur sniffs, one arm wrapped around Phil's waist in a hug, and he presses his face more into Phil's shirt, like he's trying to hold on for dear life. And you'll come back. Wilbur whispers. You'll return back with a little brother. Yes. And you'll be careful? Techno asks. Promise you'll be careful. I promise. Phil says it without hesitation. Both Techno and Wilbur think it over in their minds. They both know, in their hearts, that if they go with Phil, they become a danger. Phil wants to protect them. And he's stupid for that. It puts him in danger with that. They can't have that. And then again, they can't bear to let him leave. But when faced with those two choices, letting him leave and have it be safer, or going with him and making it be more of a danger because of them? Technoblade lets out a shaky sigh. You have to come back, he says. You will come back. Nothing can stop me from returning to you two. Phil smiles. Nothing in the world. Wilbur lets out a little laugh. You're such an idiot, Dad. Hey. Phil says, and Technoblade lets out a huff. You're such an idiot. Wilbur mutters, I love you. He says, nearly too quiet to hear. Phil laughs a little, but it sounds more like a sob. I love you too. I love you both, okay? I love you both so much. You're going to return, Technoblade says, nearly making it sound like a threat, and Phil just nods. When you get back, you have to give us both hugs for a whole hour. 2 hours. Wilbur adds. 3. Technoblade challenges. Whatever you want. Phil grins. Are you really all right with me going? As long as you come back. Wilbur nods. You'll come back. His voice echoes and swirls around the three of them. Magic in every syllable. Technoblade squeezes Wilbur's hand. Phil hardly even notices the fact Wilbur's woven a command onto him. He hardly notices because there was no chance of him ever leaving for good. The command is useless, because Phil would return no matter what. There's one more thing, Phil says, and he can feel them both tense up in his arms, preparing for bad news. You're going to have a new little brother. Silence sits in the air for a moment. Do you think he needs a name for when he gets here? Both Technoblade and Wilbur snap their heads up at Phil. Wide eyes. They're still a mess of tears, still sniffling and trying not to sob all over again. But with that news, it puts a new bit of hope into them. Another assurance that Phil is going to return. After a few minutes of calming down, and Phil giving a few more promises to them both, Phil picks them up off the floor, and they go to look through books for names. Phil sits on the bed with Techno and Wilbur leaning back against him, the two of them bickering away lightly over the book in their hands. There's books scattered around them. Storybooks with characters' names. Ideas for something that could fit their new addition for the family. Technoblade insists on the name Theseus, from a story he once read. Wilbur says it's too serious. And dumb, Phil gently scolds him. He says that it should be Thomas instead. They both settle on the name Tommy. They both quietly think it's a nickname for the name they chose.